Right, so here we are under the bright lights in London Bridge. Navid Amin, Head of Procurement at WSP. Official title. Official title. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
How you doing? You all right?
Good, thank you.
Excellent stuff. So we've got various things to talk about today, and I think there's some areas that I'd like to delve into just in terms of your own specific experience.
Yeah.
There's some areas where I'm really interested in your opinion.
Sure.
And there's probably a few areas that we might end up having a little bit of a debate about.
Of course.
But I think the key thing that I'd like to dive into today is just understanding procurement challenges from the perspective of services-based organisations.
Yeah.
Now, this conversation kind of came about through us having a prior conversation where we were just discussing this, and some of the points that you were bringing up I found really, really interesting. I just thought this is the sort of thing that people need to hear, this type of conversation.
Let's hope so.
Let's hope so. You better live up to expectations
I was going to say, that's quite the build-up.
Anyway, talking about build-up,
Yeah.
how about we start with that? So do you want to just give us a bit of background on how you got into the industry and what is it you describe, or your wife describes you as doing now?
No, I can't say that. I'm not going to say that, especially on a podcast. Okay. I refuse to use that term. Yeah, so I started in 2000, and I'll tell you really quickly. So I did a logistics degree, supply chain degree, and I applied for pretty much every single supply chain / logistics graduate training scheme, right? So I got to, and I always get to the final stages. Always Sainsbury's, Asda, I think it was Nestle, British American Tobacco, and I got to the assessment centres, and I just always just fell apart, right? Just fell apart, and it was just tension. It was nerves, and honestly, I was kind of coming to the end of the year, and I had one application left. And it was for GlaxoSmithKline, it was procurement. And I went along and had my first interview, and it was an hour's interview. And honestly, for 50 minutes with this guy whose name I remember, who was a really nice guy, and all we spoke about was Wazimat-Cram, Whack-Our Units, and reverse swing. Genuinely, that's all we talked about. And
great way to connect.
And then there was an assessment centre after that, actually, which was by the by. But it was funny because when I did kind of join and I got into the graduate scheme, he was like, as soon as we met and we spent 50 minutes talking about how to reverse the ball, he goes, I know, I wanted you in my company. And it was strange, right? And it's just one of those quirks of fate. So my first placement was actually doing direct procurement.
Right.
So I was based in Gloucestershire at the Ribena and Lucasade factory. So it was really fun, buying the foil that used to go around the Ribena bottle.
All right.
And cartons and just production equipment. Some of the flavours that go into toothpastes. That was my first year. Got to know how a factory was run.
Right.
And then I went down to London doing software procurement for GSK. I did that for 3 years. Kind of got itchy feet.
Had there been many trips to the cricket along the way?
Yeah, absolutely, especially Edgbaston, right? Because I'm from Wolverhampton originally, so Warwickshire. And then we went to, what did I do? Yeah, I went to Vodafone. So Vodafone for a couple of years. Again, software procurement, but it was what we were called service platforms.
Right.
So it was really weird. Now looking back on it, some of the stuff you were buying was really bonkers. Like ringback tones.
Oh, really?
Do you remember what that was?
Yeah.
So when you pick up a phone, rather than hearing a ring, I'd hear your favourite song.
Yeah.
Right? So we'd buy a platform for that. And this is when it was real cutting edge stuff. Mobile TV was coming out.
Right.
Right? So you had to buy kind of streaming platforms from startups from Europe. And in looking back on it now, it was really pixely. These guys didn't really know how to price a product. We really didn't know what it was worth. But it was a really, really interesting time. So different from GSK, which was, as a pharmaceutical organisation, quite risk averse.
Yeah, I should imagine, yeah.
Whereas Vodafone, specifically when you're talking about that kind of marketing stuff, was all about how can I get this out before O2?
Yeah.
Right? How can I get this out before T-Mobile? So it was a different type of procurement. So I did that for a couple of years. And actually, I had a conversation with my ex-manager at GSK, and I just ended up going back. And I was there for a good 14, 15 years, buying IT again. Then I went to financial outsource services, consultancy services, like the Big Four. And then, a new CPO started. So I did special projects, kind of creating a kind of savings management framework.
Right.
Working on our working capital, converting £4 billion worth of payment terms to 60 days net or even more to help our position. And then I moved into R&D. So buying clinical trial services. No, not a scientist by any way, shape or form. But that was quite a big learning curve. And I finished my career at GSK buying lab supplies and equipment for, I think it was a number of sites. Must be sites around 30 around the world. So that was a really kind of potted history of my career. And then, WSP. So that was my kind of first head of procurement role at WSP, which is a large Canadian engineering consultancy firm based in Montreal.
Yeah, a couple of things out that I think really interesting. Great the way you put it across, by the way. But firstly, the assessment centres, when you went through the assessment part of the interview, when you were, what was it about that was really kind of off-putting or kind of tricky? How was it? How were they structured?
So then they were structured in terms of potential just a small interview as well, a numerical case study, verbal reasoning, and the one that always got me was the team exercise.
Right.
And it was because I always was not, frankly, you know what? Looking back on it now, I can reflect on it being, 20 years on, I was never authentic. I was never my true self.
Because you're trying to give people what they want,
exactly.
Sort of thing. Yeah.
So it's not just a team exercise. It's when you're prepping for the exercise, you've still got the invigilators in the corners of the room watching you. So in one assessment centre, you might think, you know what, they want someone reflective. So I'm just going to stand back and watch what everyone does and then kind of give my tuppence worth maybe and see where that goes. Your feedback would come and it'd be like, too quiet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Didn't really have an opinion. So the next assessment centre, you'd totally flip it.
Yeah.
Right?
Let's try a different approach.
You try a different approach. You took over people. You had no concept of taking people along with you, no concept of influencing people because you're just out of uni, right? These things are kind of, you don't know about these things. And the feedback would be, didn't listen to anyone, own view. And I just found it really, really hard. And the one place where I was my authentic self, I got the role.
Yeah.
Right? And that was the GSK one. I just thought, there were many reasons I thought I wasn't going to get that role. Right? There were 4 people there from one university who were kind of colluding. They were helping them. They were kind of helping each other with the presentations. Me and this other guy kind of looked at each other and we're like, yeah, we're not going to get these. There is a cat in hell's chance of us getting these roles.
Did that kind of take the pressure off a little bit?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Totally. And during the interview, the exercise, presentation, I was just myself.
Yeah.
Right? I was just totally myself. And worked.
I think that's really interesting. And I think that's it's a great anecdote for people coming into the market, people looking at moving on in their careers and things like that. Is just be yourself and bring the value that you can bring as yourself.
100%.
And I think, to a certain extent with some large organisations, the way they structure their hiring process and their graduate programs might have changed a bit from that. But it's worth bearing, for companies and for individuals, it's worth bearing those sort of things in mind, isn't it?
Right? We're hiring, right? We're hiring 2 roles at the moment. And what I look for people is absolutely that authenticity.
Mm.
But I think it goes to more for the candidates as well. When they come for a role, be your authentic self.
Yeah.
Right. If this industry doesn't interest you, if procurement doesn't interest you, we can see through that. You can see through that, and you're not going to be successful in that role.
Yeah, it's that whole kind of thing of people kind of kidding themselves that they want to make it a good match when it isn't a good match.
Correct.
Like if it is a good match, happy days all round. If it isn't, it's not going to end well, is it, for either party?
Exactly.
I think that's a really important point you make there. The other thing was just to kind of point from my angle, you've worked on buying in a lot of different areas.
Yeah.
and then and obviously quite a bit of it was around kind of goods and equipment, obviously tech as well. But now you're in an environment where I'd imagine probably a very high percentage, 85-90%, is services.
Correct.
What was that transition like when you first came into WSP?
So I was exposed to kind of services back at GSK.
Yeah.
Right. And also at Vodafone, because yes, I'm buying a piece of software, but actually when you're buying that piece of software, a large part of the total cost of implementing that is going to be the cost of implementing that piece of software. So I was exposed to that, and also with the financial accounting services stuff, doing all that stuff, offshoring. It is services. So I was exposed to it there. What's different at WSP is that the services you are buying are absolutely fundamental to the end product that we are selling to our customers. Yeah. If you're working in a GSK, you're working for, I don't know, an FMCG, you're buying a bottle, you're buying a cap, that ends up being on the shelf, right? The services I buy do not end up being on the shelf. They are a contributor to helping you be a successful organization and that product getting to our customers. It's different for us, right? We have 9,000 people now in the UK, right? 60, 70,000 globally who are experts in what they do. Architects, ecologists, archaeologists, engineers of every single shade in our organization. But when we form a core team, potentially we may not have those skill sets internally, or they're on other projects. So what we procure, what we buy, ends up being the end product for our customers. Make sense?
Yeah, and this when we had our first chat, when we just initially started speaking, that was one of the things I found really interesting, was just your breakdown of direct versus indirect.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that I find fascinating in procurement is the kind of lack of uniformity around categorization. And obviously you've got some people who will take a direct versus indirect approach. Majority of organizations take a category-based strategy.
Yeah.
But there's not, even in the way that procurement teams are structured, it's not something that's a one-size-fits-all. It's quite flexible. And if you look at how different organizations will see different definitions, it depends.
Absolutely.
So how within WSP, how you see direct versus indirect?
I just totally flipped on its head.
Yeah.
So if I look at all the stuff that we buy, the tangibles, laptops, PPE, all that sits in indirect.
Yeah.
Right. Direct for me and direct for WSP is subcontractors, sub-consultants, which again form part of our kind of formal supply chain. They're services. It's all services, but we call them directs because they form part of the end product that we're selling on.
Yeah, and I've just found that really interesting in terms of that viewpoint, and that it kind of it just exposes the wider conversation around how procurement is structured in different organizations, how it needs to be approached, how much is the same across organizations and how much needs to be tailored in terms of strategy and use of technology and, the way that the function operates. But the other thing I just found really interesting about it is I have a particular area of interest in how organizations get work done. So obviously services procurement being an element of one of the options of how organizations get work done. Also can get work done with their employees, and they can also get work done with contract and temporary staff, as well as outsourcing it. So it all depends how you want to balance the risk, the cost, outcome versus time, and all these sorts of things. But ultimately, it's all just the overall capacity and capability of that organization, which I think is fascinating when you look at it with an organization like WSP, where it's so intrinsic, and how you manage that supply chain.
Yeah.
And we can come on to it later, but how you can try and build value as a procurement function.
Yeah.
I thought that was a particularly interesting area of it, because it's quite complex managing all those people-based services, I would imagine.
And listen, if I was to sit here and say that we've cracked it, that would be a lie and a fib. It's super complex. And what we try and do, for our own sanity more than anything else, is still use those categories, right? So if I'm buying architectural services, it's very different to ground investigation surveys, which is essentially, someone going in and digging a trench somewhere in Warwickshire where, the HS2 line is going to be going through. They're different, and you've got to look at them slightly differently too. Now, you've talked about the fact that these guys, it's about getting work done. Get that. Yeah, absolutely. That is a fundamental. That's your foundation. This stuff needs to get done. The question then becomes how it gets done and who does it. And those are kind of questions that we have to answer using our category strategy.
Right.
So I'll give you an example. So you might be HS2, for instance, right? You're HS2. You want to work with WSP to kind of map out where this rail route is going. And you look at WSP and you're thinking, well, these guys are all engineers, right? Absolutely, they'll tell me where this line should be going through. But are they really going to help me? And will they be the right organization to help me dig that trench, for instance? The probably answer to that probably is no. So what they'll say, HS2, what you might say to me is, this is great. We want you to use you. But actually, we want you to partner with this organization, right? So we get told sometimes who actually we need to be working with, yeah? So that whole kind of WSP experience for the customer is seamless.
Right.
Yeah? That's one element of it. And then the second element of it, and I think this goes for all categories and all organizations, we've got very, very experienced people in our company who've been doing this for a number of years who know who they like to work with.
Right.
So there are trusted advisors, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then thirdly, which is complex, and we find this is a bit of a challenge because we have this concept of the supplier, but actually, a lot of the suppliers that we use are actually also our partners,
right? Because
we have joint ventures.
Oh, okay.
Right. So we bid together.
But that adds a whole new element to it as well, doesn't it, from a procurement perspective?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because I look at a spend report, some of the biggest numbers on that spend report are our competitors. And you're kind of going, well, listen, this is spend that I can attack. This is something I can take a look at, get a category strategy going, and you get really excited about it. And then, one of the C-suite say, yeah, great, do that. But you also need to be super careful about the fact that we're in a JV with these guys in a different part of the country, right? So you can do it, but you got to expect them to do it then back to us, right? And the example I give is, we have asked a lot of people about their diversity in their supply chains, and we send out questionnaires. We're going to do one very soon in regards to level 3 emissions.
Right.
What does that look like?
All the scope 3 stuff,
chain?
Yeah,
exactly. And again, from my standpoint, it could have been really easy just to send out, a kind of mass email to our 2,000 or 3,000 suppliers saying, fill this in. But we can't. Because actually a majority of those are our customers. They're our clients. They're our joint venture partners. So the procurement team, have really got to have that mindset to say, you really need to kind of understand your supply base here. You need to segment them. And you've got to have those really strong relationships with your internal stakeholders to make sure that you're totally aligned in terms of how we're treating these JVs, because that could be the difference between them partnering with us and not partnering with us.
So the supplier relationship management side of it is multifaceted, in the sense that it's at the front end of the process, involved with bids and things like that. So the back end of the process in terms of delivery, but also your suppliers could be your partners, could also be your competitors.
Yeah,
it's a hugely collaborative exercise, but ultimately it's all about delivering value to the customer and for the whole supply chain to work effectively together to do that. But there's a lot of
just on that. So we're not there yet, right? Again, with your traditional kind of suppliers, maybe in the indirect space, travel, facilities management, all that kind of good stuff, we do SRM, right? What you would, and the majority of people potentially listening to this are going to think about, what good SRM is. Your 3-stage model and your joint goals and gain sharing and all that kind of stuff. Have procurement really had a role in kind of getting in and managing or even being part of the discussions with a JV? No. Right? Because that's like getting in and talking to a customer, right? Potentially, that's when you're talking to corporate development. You kind of extending the boundaries of procurement into areas that we really, well, in my previous career, I've never been in, which is, how can I work with you together to win more business? That's corporate development. And I think it requires a different skill set, totally different mindset. But we need to have a history of success in these kind of ventures, in these kind of areas, for frankly some of the senior stakeholders in our business to trust us to have those conversations. We're creating that pipeline. And at some juncture, I'm going to say, I want to be allowed to talk to that supplier, customer /JV or whatever it is, but we're just not there yet.
I can see how that's very much an evolution. And I think the industry and the type of work that WSP do, it pushes that, accelerates that evolution with those type of conversations. But I've always thought, I've said it before, and no doubt I'll say it again, but I feel like procurement sits at an amazing kind of juncture within most organizations in terms of their visibility of data and feedback. So you can see what's going on inside the organization, you can see what's going on with the external capacity, and you can also see what the external capacity think of what's going on inside the organization and vice versa. So you're privy to a lot of information where you can get involved with that. And that again ties into the kind of the value conversation. That
you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. And one of the reasons and one of the levers to use for us to kind of have those conversations is because I've asked the question, so who owns this relationship with this JV across WSP? And normally the answer is, well, no, we do it by business unit. So the 4 business units. So we'll have someone who manages this relationship for, I don't know, property and buildings. We'll have someone managing this relationship for transport and infrastructure. But rarely, very rarely do you have someone who says, right, what are we doing with this organization across the piece? And I just absolutely think, because we have the data and we sometimes have those relationships where we can do that. But again, it just goes back to the fact that you need to kind of have that history before people kind of start trusting you with that. We do that for all our indirect spend. We do it for some of our direct spend. And we're really talking about the big boys here now, the big kind of meaty, really strategic suppliers to our organisation.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things that's going to be crucial with that is centralising the data effectively. Mm-hmm. It was interesting when you were talking earlier about the kind of the known networks where you've got SMEs within the business who will know various suppliers and sub-consultants that they know in a particular area of expertise, archaeology, for example. They know some real experts that they're happy to use. But if they're busy on working on a particular project, other people might not be aware of those suppliers that could be used in other areas. And it's just, procurement have the opportunity to really centralise that data, performance data as well as capabilities. And that ties into also the knowledge of who's working on what, where you're addressing a particular supplier. The challenge, there's an additional challenge in being not only able to identify their capabilities, but also to able to identify how that relationship currently sits with other.
Absolutely.
Are they working on a joint venture somewhere else in the business? What other projects they're involved with? I imagine that's probably part of the ongoing kind of journey.
Absolutely. So there is a really, really basic feedback mechanism at the moment, right? So. Because we can't track everything as a procurement team. It's impossible, right? So what we say is if you do have feedback about good experience or bad experience, send it to our supply chain team and they'll log it. You get enough of those, you get enough information to say this supplier actually was just not great. We'll block them, right? Because why would I want someone else to have a poor experience who's trying to buy services in a particular area in WSP, so we'll block them. But that data, and I think you're kind of alluding to it, it's in silos.
Yeah.
Right? That data is not connected to my supplier master data. My supplier master data is not connected to my SRM information, right? My spend data is sitting in a separate bucket as well. And at some juncture, it would be great just to have all this management information, which I can then pull out from one source.
Yeah.
And then present that not only to my category managers and my team, but to the senior most leaders in the organization, right? Because that is more power to the argument we were talking about previously. Is this is why I should be playing in this area, because I've got all this data and I've got all this visibility, and I can give you what potentially no one else in the organization can.
Yeah, and it's the depth and nuance to the data as well, because you might get a supplier that if you measure them on quantitative metrics, they're always overrunning on cost, they're always late, but whose fault is that? It might be that the actual business stakeholder would say 5 out of 5 stars in every area, they're doing a fantastic job. The delays were due to unforeseen things coming up in the project, or they were internal delays that then affected the supplier. So I think, that's definitely an area that I'm a huge advocate of. It's kind of, for us, what we're doing as a business, it's our whole reason for being, is to capture that and say, understand what's being promised in a services contract, and then what's actually delivered and how it's delivered, to what levels of satisfaction, etc. Because it is complicated, because I don't know whether this happens with WSP with that engineering slant to it, but sometimes it's quite hard to define projects when you get started, and the definition of what's going to need to be done is almost like step one of the process half the time, particularly with IT type projects.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then obviously there are going to be changes along the way where stuff's contracted, but then it has to change and it has to be updated, and that data is so fundamentally useful.
Yeah.
Both, as I say, with regards to the quantitative signals and also that qualitative feedback, which might be, for example, how well did they perform from an environmental, ecological point of view with what they were doing with earthworks, or what was their communication like, or however that might be structured, or it might be ongoing assessment of things like diversity and other ESG metrics that you're tracking. But yeah, I think once you can centralise that information, then absolutely that power is in procurement's hands to be able to really help influence the business. And it's hugely useful for the business because, as I was saying earlier, when we were talking about kind of capacity and capability and how organisations get work done, the C-suite really want to understand what's the most effective use of all of our resources, whatever that might look like. And the supply chain, obviously, in WSP's case, is a hugely important part of that.
I hope so. And it has been, and it's increasingly so. And I want to pick up something like you talked about, in terms of what our kind of goals are. So, how do we become important to the C-suite? And that's a really important question that I think a lot of procurement people need to kind of ask themselves, because it's different for different organizations. The first thing is cost savings, right? I don't think that's ever going to go away. And I know it's slightly unfashionable to say so, but I think that's our kind of, that's your meat and two potatoes, right? That's your basics. You've got to do that. It's your foundational. It's never going to go away. Over the past few years, there's been a whole host of stuff that we've got to do, right? ESG, diversity, risk, everything. And sometimes I do think, there's this kind of clamor to say that's all we do. I disagree with that. Genuinely, I disagree with that. And I tell my team this all the time. I say, listen, guys, at the end of the year, when I'm sitting down in front of the boss, what he doesn't ask me about, quite honestly, is how did you get on with your ESG targets first? Or tell me about the risk process that you put in place. No, the first thing he always says is, well, all right, you said you were going to save this. What impact to the bottom line, or more importantly, what impact to EBIT have you had, right? I think we've got to do that. The other stuff is and. It's not or, it's and. And you've got to be focusing on ESG, and you've got to be focusing on diversity. So what we've done is to kind of take a little step up and say, listen, we rank projects 5 ways now. And we say, actually, this project is going to deliver cost savings. Yeah? This project is either going to do cost savings or simplification. It's going to reduce the supply base. It's going to help with my ESG goals. And I think this is the bit I really like about WSP. It's either going to help us win work. Yeah. You can classify those 5, if you can classify a procurement project in those 5 areas, it really kind of helps people take note, right? Specifically the winning work one.
Yeah.
And you are absolutely linking what you can call a back office function with the lifeblood of the organization, right? Which is your pipeline. ESG and simplification, we've taken that. That's a straight drawdown from our corporate strategy. Yeah, look at that corporate strategy. We want to simplify the way that the engineers can buy, not just buy stuff, but all sorts of stuff. We want them to be focusing on clients as opposed to be focusing on kind of back-end tasks. So what can I do and what can the team do to help do that? So it's simplification. And the other one is ESG, right? We're all about the built environment, where we make stuff, we design stuff, we have an impact on the world around us. So absolutely, ESG is really core to the business, and we have a target, a net neutral target as well, that has to be implemented into our designs. So if the organisation is talking about that, why as a procurement function are we not? So we as a team actually decided that we are going to take some of these key tenets of our corporate strategy and make them something that we also going to live by too. Your C-suite start seeing that. Senior leaders in the organisation start seeing that. They see that you get it. So you're not just talking about the numbers again. I am talking about numbers, but I'm talking about them alongside stuff that's interesting to them. You're pushing on the door then.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's strategic alignment, isn't it?
100%.
The organisation needs a clear strategy. It needs to be well communicated to every part of the organisation. Every part of the organisation needs to know how they're contributing, where they fit in, and they need to be aiming towards that same goal. So I think sometimes where you have that pure savings approach, that can detract from that because it's too limiting. And it's definitely where with the evolution of procurement as a function is going. But there's work to be done because savings are relatively, depends, easy to measure and easy to understand and comprehend. Whereas the value side of it is much more difficult.
It's very difficult. So, we've just done a piece of work for we did it last year for the biggest bid that WSP actually undertook. And my team spent some time running an RFP process for a constituent sub-consultant for that bid.
Right.
And we made 15 to 20% savings, I can't remember now, for this particular element. That's fine, you could track that. Right, how much you spend, how much did I save? But trying to work out what the value of us actually doing that piece of work in terms of us getting more work, that's harder. It's so much more difficult.
And it's going to take time.
And, it's something that we've struggled with because we don't know how to kind of encapsulate it, to be honest, and present it back to, the C-suite and say, well, this is the kind of indirect impact we have had on winning work.
It's kind of like marketing attribution. You might see that if you're a kind of B2C company marketing to individuals, you might be doing Google AdWords or I don't know, LinkedIn advertising if it's more B2B. And you might be getting clicks on Google, but your traffic might look like it's coming directly.
Yeah.
So, but the indirect attribution of that is that somebody's seen your advert on Google or on the TV or wherever it might be, and that's influenced them to the point that when it comes to actually making a decision to click on your website or make a purchase or do whatever, that's influenced it.
That's a really good analogy, actually.
Yeah, it's that kind of marketing attribution model, which does take time because how you operate with suppliers could affect a bid further down the line.
Yeah.
Because you built that really good relationship with that supplier and you've got everything completely lined up, when it comes to the bid, it's just absolutely nailed.
And just one quick, because you talked about creating that relationship with that supplier. So the savings were one thing. One of the pieces of feedback we found really interesting during that process was post the bid, everything was kind of shut and done. The suppliers came back and said, you know what? We really liked the process that you guys had run. Never really done that before, but it was super structured. We kind of knew what we were being measured against. You were open in terms of where we needed to kind of get to. And that structure, they really valued it. And they said that actually makes us want to work with WSP more. So when we're out there and we're on this framework and we want to pick some suppliers, it's not just about the savings. It's actually about kind of creating that impression of us and what we're like as a company to work with. Because everyone talks about wanting to be easy to do business with. That was a prime example where we tried to show some of these organizations that actually, if you're going to work with WSP, it'll be in a systematic, measured, and measurable approach. And I think they really, really like that.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Putting a value on it, though, that's a hard one.
Yeah, it's like, for example, a supplier wanting to align with companies that have the same kind of ethical goals around, for example, ESG type metrics. They want to align with companies. Suppliers are in demand. Decent suppliers are in demand. So it's about aligning culturally and ethically and commercially, but it's also about being easy to work with. Because if from the supplier's point of view, if you're working with an end customer that's an absolute nightmare to deal with, it might be lucrative, but the time drain and the problems it causes might negate that. So it's effectively being a customer of choice as well, isn't it?
Yes.
And that by running that detailed structured process, you're allowing your strategy to filter out to those external suppliers.
Absolutely.
Which, in terms of the way that you get work done, that they're such an essential part of that. I think that makes complete sense. Mm. But just going back to the cost side of it and the savings side of it, have you seen at times, or can you envisage situations where that can actually be detrimental to an organisation, where there's such a focus on savings that actually, if there's a lack of understanding of the data that goes underneath that, it can actually cause problems. So, say for example, the CFO is pushing, right, we've got to make, 20% savings on our consultancy spend. If there's a lack of information around what that consultancy is, you'll know what you're spending with who. But if there's a lack of information on what those projects were, how they're feeding into the company's strategy, and maybe how well those suppliers did, then if you're just trying to make savings, you could be cutting out work that's driving new products or driving new business wins. Yeah. Or if without the right information, just making savings on the top level, I feel that potentially can have risks associated with it. I don't know what your opinion on that is.
And I agree, but I think we've also got to be realistic that all organisations at some juncture might be going through something where those cost savings are required and needed. Yeah. It's just life. I mean, look what's happening now with the cost of living crisis and potential layoffs, etc. Organisations potentially could be struggling.
Yeah.
COVID was a great example, right? COVID was a great example where WSP included, were under stress, and there were these targets. So that's going to happen. It's always going to happen. So you can't expect everyone to take a haircut. You're going to exactly end up in the scenario which you've just talked about. And this is where I think, one of the key things that we've tried to implement at WSP, and I think it's been, we've only been doing it for about half a year, but I think it's successful, is if that target came along, right, if it's 20% target, I'd say to my boss, who's a CFO, fine, we'll shoot for that, but that cannot be a procurement target. That has to be a business target, right? And what you do then is to ensure that their expertise, the guys who are owning that service line, who have the end responsibility to make sure that particular subcontractor, subconsultant, or whatever they do actually delivers to WSP, they're targeted with it. And we will help and facilitate, make sure that we can get 20% of the cost base. But those guys who are experts, if they can input their expertise and actually kind of just put their hand up and say, we're going too far now. Because if I was to cut here, I'm actually really going to impact the service in such a way as to it be undeliverable or affect our reputation. I think at that point, the business will listen, right? Because you've got an expert talking about that. If it's just a procurement target, I'd push back. I'd push back and say, we're not in the role of just doing haircuts. We do it, we have to, for the life of the business, but we'll do it in conjunction with our stakeholders.
That's a great point. That's a really great point. And it's not a question of deferring responsibility. It's a question of getting, firstly, buy-in from the business, and secondly, expertise. So it's just very grown up, in my opinion, in the sense that because I guess if it's just a procurement decision and you're forcing the savings on the stakeholders, that's going to potentially put them in chaos. They're not going to be helping with the process necessarily because the process is just being forced upon them, and they can't contribute to say, whoa, hang on a minute, that is not going to make sense. Yes, we can make a bit of savings here, but actually we need to look at this bit over here.
Correct.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense to me.
And I'll give you a real life example about it now. So, linked or not linked, I don't know. One of the things that the procurement team is frustrated with at WSP, quite honestly, is pace. Yeah. So we do our spend analysis, and we have targets from, financial targets from my boss, the board, etc. And maybe WSP wasn't really used to kind of strategic sourcing, right? And I don't think they know how to work with us. So in their list of projects, we might be 17th, right? So category managers are really finding it difficult to kind of get people's time to say, hey, listen, we really need to be kind of focusing on this because we can, reduce the number of suppliers, simplify the process for you by giving you a catalogue, and I can make you some savings. I know, that's great, that's really interesting, but I'm focused on my client, I'm focused on delivering this project. Hard to kind of get their time, right? So we've kind of implemented this thing called the Procurement Projects Review Board.
Right.
On there sits the CIO, COO, CFO. And do you know what? Rather than having 6 months worth of toing and froing now, saying, we're going to look at this category, stakeholders saying, yeah, not yet, but maybe in Q3, we'll say, cool, you know what? We'll present it to these 3 individuals. Let's let them make a call, right? We take it up, we have the discussion, and if it's a go, it's not just a procurement target now. They're pinned with it. They've got to come back in 3 months' time and say, where are you with reducing the cost base for your service, right? And it's worked really well thus far because it really reduces our timescales, but it also makes them responsible for those financial targets. And we're finding it an immensely effective way of kind of pushing out our message into the business.
And by doing that, also with those interactions with those C-suite stakeholders, you're building the trust.
Yes.
You're building the trust and building the value. But added to that, I think there's an important factor in this, which I'm quite interested in the way that procurement is developing as a profession, and the concept of new talent coming into the industry, and the type of talent that will be required in terms of data analytics, strategic thinking, because with the advancements in procurement transformation, better use of procurement technology, it's becoming less transactional. I think if an organisation was to let a function like that, or if you were to let a function like that, we're bashing up against this, but it's just the way it goes, and that's frustrating to the people that work running those categories and work within the procurement team. And also, it's going to put people off coming into the business potentially, because when people come into the business, if you're trying to bring people in who are go-getters, who want to make a difference, add value, all these sorts of things, there's got to be a process that they can go after.
Correct.
There's got to be a direction they can move in.
Yeah.
And I think it's like when some companies are really, really backward in their use of procurement technology, for example, and people are just swamped with manual transactional tasks. That's not attractive to people coming into the industry. Individuals, youngsters coming into the market have their own expectations about how things should work and how they should, what stuff they should be focusing their energies on, or what stuff should just be automated, captured in proper processes. But yeah, to inspire that next kind of cohort of people coming in, there's got to be something to go after.
You make such a good point, because we do get people coming in, and I kind of felt it as well. I've hired people, really good people, change makers, but the change doesn't come because the organisation is not ready for it. And you can feel them just kind of go bristling and finding and I've kind of sensed, are they constrained? Are they bored? Gosh, are they at flight risk? Right? All these things need to be considered. Because what we're asking for as a procurement organisation is people who are, great at category management, know a category, but who are entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
we ask for that and I look for that. And it's only recently then we've kind of given them the structure to do that. Before that, before entrepreneurial spirit, knowing the challenges that were there, I always said that what I look for is people with a kind of high emotional quotient, right? What's their emotional intelligence like? Because you can have all the technical skills in the world, but if I can't convince you, Mr. Stakeholder or Mrs. Stakeholder, to kind of work with me, think about this, then you're never going to get far. So the challenge you pose is, I'm really good, I know what to do, but you're not letting me do it. One way of tackling that has been using my emotional intelligence to bring you on board, to influence you, and all that kind of stuff that we get taught. That takes time. It has taken time. We've done it, and it takes time. And what I see is my savings kind of rolling over into the year after. I've just circumvented that now. I still want people who have got all that, but now I think that we're mature enough and we have a history of work that I can show C-suite that where we've delivered and say, actually, do you know what? I don't need to be doing that for 6 months. I can put a formal structure in place where I can get an answer in 6 weeks. Yeah. And you find the category managers love it. They love it. That doesn't mean you ignore your influencing skills. You still got to do all that. You've still got to build your relationships. It just doesn't mean you go through that cycle for 6 months.
Yeah, and I guess it's kind of, in some ways, it might take the pressure off the relationship, because if the decisions are being made at that level, then it's the business making a decision. Correct. And you can concentrate, procurement can concentrate on the relationship with the stakeholders and the relationship with the suppliers, which, I was talking about people coming in with different skills, maybe increasing skills around data analysis and all these kind of strategic things. But fundamentally, there's always going to be that massive relationship element, that communication element, empathy. So that completely makes sense to me. And like I say, it kind of takes the conflict out of it a little bit, in the sense that the decisions over there, ultimately what everybody's trying to do, or what everyone should be trying to do, is what's best for the business, what's in line with the strategy. And rather than just procurement being saddled with you've got to reduce costs by this much and everyone's going to hate you for it. If it's an overall business target.
It's a business target.
Yeah.
It's a business target. And then, the next step and the next evolution for me, honestly, is when we do our annual reviews or annual target setting, whatever comes out of that board, fine, you can put it in my development plan or whatever it may be. But I also want to see it in my stakeholders. Yeah? That target is a shared target. And that's when you are then joined to the hip. And you will deliver. And there's none of this kind of, it's a procurement savings target or it's a business saving target. It's not. It'll just be like something that we have to do together to deliver back for WSP, the business as a whole. That's the next step I want to get to.
So when you're talking about kind of being joined at the hip with your stakeholders, at the front end of the process, obviously where you have the ability to really help with, on the bid side of things, with your relationship with the suppliers, being able to recommend the right suppliers, being able to help coordinate that process. Do you feel that is that something that you didn't really see so much or didn't really see at all before you were at WSP? Or was it something you've always seen the potential for that?
No, I'll be honest. Listen, if you're buying financial accounting services, P2P stuff or record to report, you are so far away from that medicine getting to the patient. When you're buying, maybe in R&D, you a little bit, because you're buying clinical trial services. So there are people involved in kind of testing these medicines, and you've bought services which are impacting those people, of course, but never the end product. Here, and by the way, in those instances, you're not really involved in the bid stage. Yeah. WSP is totally different. We are absolutely kind of core for our largest bids. The bid directors and the bid team will come to us and kind of give us a pipeline and say, listen, a lot of bids here, probably won't be using a lot of third parties, but we have a real nice, big, juicy one in the middle of the year. and we really need your support. Yeah. And it's interesting that from last year to this year, the way they've kind of framing the questions also changed.
Right.
It's not really, well, I say that. It is about the money. It is about the pricing. Let's not get away from that. But they also want to have conversations with our suppliers and say, well, we need to find out about their ESG credentials. We need to find out about their diversity goals. We need to find out about their net carbon neutral plans. And they know that we've been working on that for 2.5 years, right? So that kind of expertise as well, the bid team really appreciate, and they want to see us bringing that to the fore as well. Not just in the RFP that we're going to send out, but in every interaction that we have with the supplier. Because I say that to my team, right? Every interaction we have with a supplier is an opportunity to condition and kind of give your message. And the bid guys love that. They really, really like that because it helps them later on when we've moved off, manage that relationship because the foundation's been set.
Yeah, and I guess in certain parts of the process, your management of that relationship is going to be so essential to them because they're not going to necessarily have that relationship. And if it's a good relationship that's then handed over, it makes their life easier.
Exactly.
But I think it's really interesting to look at that, the EBIT impact and the top line impact. As you say, the top line stuff's much harder to measure, that front end stuff.
It is.
So how do you, and obviously as we kind of talked about, it's an evolution, but how do you manage the gap between the standard expectations of what your team can and will deliver versus the opportunities to kind of take it to the next level? Because that's where it feels like it's, at the moment, more difficult to justify it to the business.
Yeah, it is. So listen, we will do the standard stuff, right? So I always say that that's our prerequisite. And to get to that next level, to get to a place where, the organization is trusting us to potentially talk to and operate with those JVs, or maybe involving us in more bids, is not by talking a good game, right? You're never going to get there, or we're never going to get there. I always look for that one opportunity I can showcase.
Right.
Yeah. So we did one bid last year, which I've spoken about, right? And I use that as a platform to say, hey, John, the director of bids, we can help you further. And it's true. If we can find more like that, if I can create a history, a track record, and I can start talking about it and communicating it effectively, it starts to build the awareness in the organization with outside the financial element of the organization. And I'm really talking about the business, the core engineering community, that these guys can make a difference. Do you know when I first joined at WSP, and I think back to it now, and I'm kind of like, that's why my manager, the CFO at the time, kind of said this. He goes, do your work, but when you get that good news story, frankly, I want you to be on top of the building shouting about it. And I've got to say, right, my manager's immensely supportive of the procurement function, and a lot of the stuff that's happened is because of his support.
Yeah,
he's been brilliant. And I never really, because it's kind of alien to us, right? You might send out a little communique or a note saying, yeah, we did this category strategy. I think we're going to save this over 3 years. Great, that's your kind of done, and you move on to the next project. The CFO was like, no, you intranet. Right, I want you to get an internet. I want you to send notes out to the ops teams, etc. You're thinking, why? Why does he want me to do this? And it's all to do with creating that history.
Yeah,
creating that pipeline of work that these guys can see and say, you know what, this guy's got pedigree. The team's got pedigree, more importantly. And when these people are coming, to my meetings, then I know they've got a pedigree and I know they've got a history of adding value, right? One of the things that always really frustrates me, I'll be really honest, and I hate this term, is when people say, oh yeah, procurement does, want a seat at the table. I'm like, why? Why would I, as a business stakeholder, give you a seat at the table? Prove to me that you deserve that seat at the table, right? And that's what we've been trying to do over the past 3 years. is really trying to create that history of work that we can say, listen, guys, this is what we've delivered. And it becomes really hard for them to kind of say, we don't want to involve you.
Well, yeah, exactly. It becomes illogical to do.
Illogical.
Because at that point, you've evidenced it and you've said the business is trying to achieve X. This is the strategy. This is how we're contributing towards that strategy. So there, it's just completely logical to bring in that expertise and make value of that. Again, it's just strategic alignment, isn't it? Just going on a slightly different tangent. So firstly, going back to that, the way that what you're talking about with the way your CFO operates, that just knits everything together, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
That communication, starting early, evidencing stuff, and it's not about kind of just going rah rah rah. Look at us. It's about saying we're working hard, we're doing this. It's all contributing and celebrating those wins and those successes because they do benefit other people, and it shows that. It shows that procurement are working towards the same goals rather than being the police or whatever, in some organisations where there's that kind of misalignment. So I think that's really interesting and clearly seems to be working very well, and obviously sows the seeds for that future development of what you're looking to do with the function as a whole. If we look at the delivery of services, we go into that in a bit more detail. So one of the things I find quite interesting in this area is the opportunity to engage services on a rate-based model versus a value-based model.
Yeah.
And again, it ties into the difficulty in validating and proving like value-based decisions, which is ultimately where everyone says they're trying to get to and where it makes sense for people to try and go.
Yeah.
But it needs to be measured and defined effectively. But it ties into risk and things like that as well. How do you see it in terms of, and how does the business see it currently when you address that from a traditional rate-based, it's quite simple, I know that this type of person's this rate, versus that outcome-based?
Do you know what? I struggle with this one. I really struggle with this one. I'll come on to that bit in a bit. But WSP as an organisation, I think we have internal kind of conflicts about this because we're a professional services organisation as well, right? So you speak to some very senior people, and because we're a rate-based organisation at the moment, and I think some senior people will say, actually, do you know what? We want to start moving into a place of where we are providing proposals from a value-based perspective. Because we've been doing this a long time. Yeah? We can engineer a building, we can design a tunnel, we can tell you where a railway should go, etc. And there is an inherent value to that expertise. We should be pricing thus. Some say no, day rates and all that kind of good jazz. On the flip side, in the procurement standpoint, we are, as you said, we're increasingly beginning to see proposals being come through which are value-based proposals. And the reason I struggle with them is innately and inherently, as a procurement person, I want to get that number, and it's usually that one number, and I want it exploded.
Yeah, you'll break it down.
I really want to see what's in it. And the more I think about it, I don't think that's an unfair question. I genuinely don't think that's an unfair question. If you're going to price your value and your expertise, fine. But tell me what that's worth. So I can measure that against what another organisation think that their value and experience is worth. The same way that I get a bill of materials, right, and I get a cost at the bottom. Fine. Works for a widget. But why can't I do that for professional services? You know? How many partner days am I getting? How many director days am I getting? How many junior manager days am I getting? Cool, fine. That's a really basic number. But you've also put something else in there. You've put a cost of your value in there. And I want to know that. I'm not going to let my team come back to me and say, here's a proposal, it's £400,000, it's value-based, so I didn't get a breakdown of it. If I don't ask the question, when we go for sign-off for £400,000, do you think the C-suite are really just going to sign that off without asking any questions? They're not. So we better get used to seeing these value-based propositions. But just because it's got value-based written all over it doesn't mean that you can't start to interrogate it and investigate it. And I think we're on this kind of cusp now of, maybe kind of going into the kind of marketing procurement world where everything is value-based, and, you can't really ask me that because it's all about the brand, it's all about getting more sales. Listen, if we start seeing that in the more kind of sub-consultants and subcontracting world,
technical stuff,
we're going to push back.
I think it's such an interesting area of discussion because value-based pricing or outcome-based pricing. So if you look at it as an outcome rather than necessarily as a value, or the two being kind of combined, then there are certain things. It depends how your contracts are structured. Yeah. So if you've got a rate-based and a time-based contract, it depends how much that can just run on. Because it's like when companies look at, if they're going to do an IT project, I could hire a load of Java developers, X amount per day, or I could outsource it to this company who are going to deliver the project for me. If I hire these developers, it's kind of like I feel comfortable knowing the rates I'm paying. But how long is it going to take? Is the project going to go wrong? Where does the risk sit? Versus if it's on an outcome basis, that company are going to deliver it, and if they run over their own budget, that's their problem.
It is, yeah.
So there's that element to it as well. But I think where a company does have that intrinsic value and that expertise, in the same way that WSP have that intrinsic value and expertise, as you say, all that inherent experience of doing all these projects, that is definitely worth something. So what's the old story about the engineer, the boat engineer? When the man who owns the big giant container ship says, there's something wrong with my boat, I need you to come. He tries everybody, no one can fix it, and this guy comes along, spends some time looking at it, and then just taps the engine with a hammer, and it works, and he gives him the bill for £10,000. Says, oh, can you charge me that? He says, well, I'll break it down for you. It's £1 for tapping it with a hammer and $9,999 for knowing where to tap. Exactly.
Yeah.
So oldest story in the world, but there is that. How do people price that out? And that's where some organisations will become more proud to say, we know we can deliver this. We're comfortable we can deliver for the budget we've set forward, and we know we're going to do a great job because our brand, our reputation, our previous work with you, and all these sort of things. But like you say, when it comes into that, there's this. It's not a given that people are just going to accept that.
No.
But I think organisations should be able to break it down. It's just that they're probably not used to doing that.
Honestly, potentially, I don't see any different from me kind of scoring it and saying, what's day rate for X, day rate for Y, day rate for Z, and then you can say, well, actually, these guys, company A, B, C in my RFP or whatever, are actually putting a value on their expertise, and it's 10,000 versus 12,000 versus 15,000, and you compare and contrast. I know you take it in the round, I get that, but I think you got to be able to kind of say, well, what is it? What is that intrinsic number that you're putting onto that value? Because I want to know.
And how do you see that from the risk perspective, in the sense of the difference in outsourcing to that supplier on a rate-based contract versus an outcome-based contract? Do you see much difference in the risk element?
Do you know what I see? The difference is I always think an outcome-based contract is only ever as good as the requirements that we have sent across are going to be. So we've been in a situation recently, an IT project, where it was outcome-based, right? Overran significantly. And the supplier was kind of getting frustrated. And you know what? I can kind of understand their frustration. Because the spec, the vision that we had provided, just poor. Just poor. So fine. Go with the outcome-based contract because it makes sense. But again, at the beginning of that process, at least have a common understanding of what that outcome is and document it, right? Just because it's outcome, and you can say, I want that system up and ready in 6 months, and it's got to have 60 users on it, concurrent, etc., etc. That's not enough. It's just genuinely not enough. Everyone has to sit down and say, right, in black and white, write it down. What exactly does this thing look like? If you haven't got that, potentially do your day rates. But then, this whole thing in IT projects now about doing the sprints, kind of phasing it. I'm a big fan of that.
Yep.
I am definitely a big fan
approach.
of that. Absolutely. I'm a big fan of that because you kind of get to see, where you are after the first 2 weeks, the first 4 weeks, and you'll get a sense really quickly if you're going to hit that target or not. So we try and do our IT projects at least along that methodology.
I think it's such a fascinating area of discussion. Pardon me. When you're looking at the outcome-based stuff, requirements definition, how the collaboration can work. We're doing loads of work around that in terms of when you're creating a requirement, how can the stakeholder effectively collaborate with procurement to get guidance on how to create that requirement? Okay, procurement aren't the SME. The stakeholder might not be the SME, but you can still structure it correctly and make sure you're capturing the right elements. And then how can you collaborate with expert suppliers, maybe just one supplier to help build the requirement, although you don't want to create a self-fulfilling prophecy, versus working with multiple different suppliers to look at different ways that requirement could be shaped in that kind of collaborative process to really build something effective. But then you've got to capture it, and then you've got to measure what's delivered against it, because stuff's going to change anyway.
Yeah.
Like you say, a milestone or a deliverable could be a sprint in an agile process, which then will help define the next sprint or the next iteration of that particular project. But it's a fascinating area. I think alongside the potential we discussed earlier for doing a separate podcast on me getting caught in a rip current on a holiday.
I was going to say, I know it's fascinating. I hope other people find it fascinating. My wife would be bored to tears listening to this.
I think it's really interesting, and it's great to get your take on it, because these aren't kind of like just cut and dried issues. There's nuance to it.
No, yeah.
There's nuance to it.
And I think, one of the things I've always said, you and I were talking about this before, right? Just because it's new doesn't mean it's right. Yeah, and we can all jump on the bandwagon. And I'm always one to say, like, well, let me see what this process is or what this idea is. Let's prove it. Prove it, and then we can start saying, yeah, you know what, this has made a real difference to our function. And there's a lot of stuff happening at the moment, which is, I think is going to come. By the way, I want to ask you this. Have you used ChatGPT yet?
I have.
Listen,
it did blow my mind.
Can I just say, so listen, honestly, so, everyone keeps talking about AI is going to change procurement. AI is going to change procurement. And I was like, listen, never. Not going to happen. Oh, my God. That thing is amazing.
Yeah.
And I think, you start putting that into organizations and you start thinking about how we can use that in our function. That is something that's going to change the way that we work.
Yeah.
Genuinely, I couldn't believe it. It was just stunning.
Requirements definition,
Everything.
just creating narratives on the sales side of things.
Yeah.
I saw one recently where a chat GPT application to a job had got an interview, and it's pretty amazing.
If we're talking about,
and we're at the start of it, really.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a beta. It's just total loss of beta. And if the most simplest application for that is like a chatbot, right? You kind of go in and say, my purchase order number is this, where is it? And it's standard responses that come back. That is not a standard responses. Can you imagine that?
Yeah.
Right? You start talking to an operative.
Yeah.
And I was like, I looked at that and I thought, even at the kind of total and utter back end of that process, this is going to change. But there were absolutely going to be applications for this further up the food chain. Stuff like that is going to change our roles.
Yeah. The last thing I was going to ask you actually was just in terms of kind of your thoughts for the immediate future, your plans for the immediate future, because there's certain things that you can implement and that you're planning and you're already doing and rolling out, but there's going to be other things that just come along the way, like technology advancements like that are just going to be able to be slotted in, that suddenly chunk it up to the next level of win. What are your kind of key sort of expectations and aspirations for the kind of immediate future, next 12 months?
Oh, next 12 months. So the one thing I think we're all struggling with, and I've talked about this at that conference we met at, which is supplier data, right? So as an organization which gets a lot of RFP tenders from government, we get a lot of questions asked about our supply chain. So I'll give you an example. I'll use this example because it just blew my mind. we had a question which basically said, how many diverse suppliers or SMEs are you using with an 8.5-mile radius of Curzon Street Station in Birmingham?
That's pretty specific.
Genuinely, I did not know. Genuinely, I do not know. And when you kind of ask around the organisation, people don't really know. But we know what we did. We kind of answered it. We looked at who we had, SMEs, did that totaling up. We've got, lots of techie software. So we mapped the postcodes from our supplier database onto the supplier base some of these engineers have got, and we gave them an answer, right? But that was a lot of effort. We get asked questions like, which of your suppliers is now paying living wage, right? Genuinely, I don't know, right? Because we don't capture this information. And there's this real tension between sending out supplier questionnaires and supplier onboarding questionnaires, which are 150 questions long, versus us as an organization being asked all sorts about our suppliers. And I don't know how to solve it, right? There are organizations out there, specifically in the financial sector and defense sector.
Same in the defense sector.
Will do that for us,
centrally,
right? Yeah. And kind of works for them. And potentially that's the way it's going to go. Potentially that's the way it's going to go. But that's something we're trying to really focus on this year, is to say, oh yeah, by the way, I'm not making that a procurement problem. I'm making that a business problem. Because if I can't answer that question in a bid, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Potentially means we're not going to win that bid. So when we form a core team, it's not just procurement, it's the marketing guys, it's the bid guys, it's the person who's implementing our new ERP. But again, the trick is, what I found the trick is, don't make it a procurement problem, make it a business problem.
I like that. And I think, again, with that, it's a question of bringing it all together and getting everyone to understand the reasons why. The stakeholder wants to win the work, needs to satisfy the customer. You're being asked all these questions to support that, and the supplier wants the work.
Yeah.
So as long as everybody understands that, then it brings it all together, and basically we've solved all the problems.
Well, ChatGPT will have solved all the problems.
Just leave it to ChatGPT. It's far simpler.
Yeah.
Quality. Well, listen, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your time.
No, thank you.
I think there's loads more stuff that we could delve into, and I'd love to kind of get your opinion on. But maybe that's one for a future conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
But I've really enjoyed our chat, and appreciate your time.
No, thank you, Johnny.
Cheers.